Now I will give floor to Florian Bieber, who is the director of Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz, and he is a coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, Policy Advisory Expert Group, which works on the Balkans. Florian.
Thank you very much, Igor, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to speak after the previous speakers have identified many of the issues which I think are important. And I think one of the three key words which have been mentioned earlier is that there's an opportunity at the moment here in Sofia and in this half of the year, that there is an urgency about this, in a certain way recognition that there is something which can be achieved in regard to the Euro-Atlantic and EU integration of the Western Balkans, and that includes also an honest analysis of the problems which have been had. And while I share some of this optimism which has been noted earlier, I also would like to emphasize some of the challenges and difficulties the region has been facing. And in particular, the fact that this urgency and this opportunity is seized, and as was mentioned, 15 years have passed since the Thessaloniki summit, suggests that this recognition was born out of a recognition of crisis, of that things were not going well in the region, and things were not going well with EU enlargement. And I think this crisis was drawn on several recognitions. First of all, the recognition that just like cars still need drivers, at least for the foreseeable future, EU integration needs drivers. It, for many years, was a process without a clear pilot steering the process. And I think this recognition that this has to be not just a technical but a political process which requires political commitment from member states and their support and their driving this process is, I think, very important, recognizing that one cannot, again, go back to not having a driver in the seat. The second element is, of course, the crisis within the European Union, which have distracted the EU for many years from providing the support and also the kind of close watch to the Western Balkans. And thirdly, it's been the crisis in the region, which have been by some identified as being, to a large extent, driven by external actors, rather destructive engagement in the region. Russia has been named, and other countries have been more seriously engaged in the Western Balkans, often to the detriment of democracy and to the detriment of governance and stability in the region. But these were often invited by domestic elites. And I want to be very clear that the problem in the region is not that just there's a stagnation, but there has been, in many aspects over recent years, and again, I don't speak for all the countries, but in some countries, backsliding. There's been a decline in the quality of democracy, a decline in media freedom, a decline in the rule of law. So it's not just about things not progressing to the extent necessary, but there's been a decrease in the quality of democracy in a substantial number of countries. And I think this is something which we have to recognize. Now, the Commission strategy of this year has been a very positive step in identifying some of the fundamental challenges the region is facing. It's very clearly stated the weaknesses. It stated the weaknesses in rule of law. It stated the weaknesses by saying that there are elements of state capture in all of the countries of the Western Balkans. It also stated very clearly that the economies of the region are not prepared for EU membership at this particular juncture. And this clarity of words was a very important signal and a very important break with earlier engagement, which did not speak in a certain way the kind of honest words which we expect among friends and partners. This is in fact different than a diplomatic relationship between two remote countries where one can extend oneself just to diplomatic niceties and leave it at that. I mean, the engagement of the European Union with the Western Balkans has to be one of honesty and clear words and public words as well, so that citizens hear them. Because this has often been the problem, that citizens of the Western Balkans don't hear the critique which might be voiced behind closed doors. So what is needed? Where do we go? A few points. First of all, we need to identify clearer rewards. And the rewards are not just about membership, but about also the tangible nature of those membership. And as Hedvig Morva has already mentioned, in the declaration we have drafted and were signed and presented a month ago, we identified some of these elements of really thinking about rewards for the countries, not unfounded rewards, not rewards given prematurely or easily, but which really support these processes, additional financial resources to transform societies, administrations, and so on. The second point is, as also been mentioned before, is thinking Balkans as part of the European Union. Not thinking of enlargement, but thinking of really of the countries as being part of the European Union, not today, but thinking of them as being part of the Europe of tomorrow, which means if we think about how the EU should look like, we need to include the countries, not think about them as separate processes. So that, I think, requires a shift of thinking, both from the European Union and from the countries themselves, not to think of themselves only as we want to join, but thinking of what do we have to do, how do we have to act as future member states, in a certain way being a constructive part of debates. The third point, which is essential, is more critical voices, more critical comments from the European Union and Western partners, including EU member states and the United States, towards the countries of the region. And when I say critical words, the strategy was very good in identifying them, but was to some degree, I would argue, undone by statements, subsequent visits of high-ranking European Union officials in the Western Balkans, which met with all the governments and which found no critical words in their public statements. In fact, praised the governments sometimes to a degree which I found indecent, considering the serious shortcomings when it comes to democracy, when it comes to freedom of speech. One would expect more honest words, which are public and which go on the record and which show the citizens that EU integration is about those values, it's about democracy, it's about rule of law and freedom of expression. And I think the EU and some, both member states and high-ranking EU officials don't have the courage to believe that the EU is, despite all the other actors, the only alternative which really citizens aspire to. Citizens don't want to move to Moscow. Citizens don't want to, don't want to see themselves join some kind of union with other countries. The only political, economic institution, structure they want to join, where they want to send their children, is the European Union. It's nothing else. And I think the EU should be in a certain way more courageous and have greater self-confidence, also to be more critical towards its Western Balkan partners. Then next, and closely related, is that we have often, we should not fall in the trap of thinking of security and shortchanging it for democracy. That, and I think this is sometimes the benefit of the increased interest in the Western Balkans of the EU and other countries has been the recognition that there's a security concern of other actors. But this should not mean that this results in supporting undemocratic practices for the sake of security. That might achieve short-term goals, but in the long term is detrimental for security. The only way that the Western Balkans can be a security asset for the European Union and address the joint security needs as democratic, pluralist, prosperous societies in the European Union. And this is sometimes forgotten, that achieving short-term security goals might close one's eyes or blindfold oneself towards the more substantial democratic deficiencies. Furthermore, and these are my two last points, is that the European Union needs to work with its member states, of course, very clearly on removing the obstacles which are from the EU side towards the full integration of all of the countries of the Western Balkans. And this, of course, finding a strategy, a way to deal with the challenge that 5 EU member states have not recognized Kosovo and are thus unable to provide a clear possibility for membership of Kosovo. This is a really serious issue. And we have to avoid, together with that, that while there are good news from 4 countries in terms of the possibility of membership, at least in a tangible future, we should not have a conference in 15 years about the Western Balkans, those who didn't make it. And this is, I think, a real risk, that we shouldn't be in a position where there are countries left behind which happen to be the countries the most vulnerable, the most susceptible to external pressure, including from some of their neighbors, and which have the most open, difficult relations internally and in the region. This would be disastrous and destabilizing. And in conclusion, I think one of the important elements which has been mentioned is the idea of removing bilateral disputes, increasing the elements of supporting that reconciliation. I'm always skeptical about the term, but improving relations and having an open dialogue, having an honest, friendly dialogue on issues where there's disagreement and tackling open questions is extremely important. I think this recognition has been essential because for many years, I believe much of the regional cooperation has focused on the hardware and not on the software, on the fact that, in fact, you can have the greatest highways, the greatest data communication, the greatest formal structures of communication, but if every memorial day of certain events in the past, of remembering the wars of the 1990s or other controversies, those relations descend into mutual accusation, name-calling, and hate speech, then the best highways won't help. So we need to tackle those issues. And the belief that we can just forget the past and societies will get over it by themselves is illusionary. We see that these open wounds are used strategically by nationalists, populists, tabloid media, and other opportunists who like to use these difficult issues. So if they're not confronted, somebody will use them. And not for the benefit of the societies. So we've identified this problem, but I think we need to find also a way to do this. And I think there the European Union and its member states can provide more support, more guidance, more tools in a certain way to address these issues, because I don't think that without tackling them, the countries will be effective member states. So in that sense, there is an opportunity, there is an interest which is important, there's a good analysis of the challenges the region is facing, but I think we're not there yet in finding the right mechanisms and the right answers to really achieve to resolve the problems we've identified. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you for raising critical concerns and certain negative trends that exist in the region that I think we need to talk about when we are discussing the region's progress and lack of it sometimes. And this is exactly why the subject of this conference is democracy that delivers, because most of the organizations that were brought from the Western Balkans, which deals with the democracy, human rights, rule of law, and which are around this table, are working on this for decade.